Hi everyone, welcome to week 13 of English 102. This week I want to talk about a major assignment you have, which is categorizing and evaluating sources. This is a kind of stepping stone between your annotated bibliography and the draft of your research essay that we'll get to next week. So let's go ahead and get started. The assignments you've got for this week include a discussion board that's individual, your third group blog, which your archivist should post, and then an individual assignment called Categorizing and Evaluating Sources. So in this video, I'll go over the assignment sheet as well as a student example and give you some kind of tips to think about as we work this week. So what I want you to think about the sources you found so far and the social issue you're focusing on. What have you learned that you didn't know before? So take a minute, pause, and ask yourself, okay, based on what I thought at the beginning and the sources I've looked at, what do I know now? Is it different from where I started? And if not, how could I make it so? So what I want you to start thinking about this week is that working thesis. So after you've gathered some sources and kind of read through some perspectives, how might you start to answer your research question? Remember that a thesis is a statement, it is a sentence, it is not a question, but it's the answer to that question. I'm going to go through an example in a minute, but after this week, when we found a few more sources and you've kind of organized those together, you're going to ask yourself, okay, now what do I believe about this social issue? Your thesis can focus on a solution. It can focus on, I think this is the biggest part of this issue. It can do a lot of things, but remember that it should state your opinion, your educated, hypothesized opinion from these sources, and that it can change. Okay, so we're just calling it a working thesis in that it can change. It doesn't have to be set in stone. It can be flexible. So the idea is that you have to have something. You have to start making sense of what you found. So for example, say my research question was, in what ways have teachers been impacted by the pandemic? So I consider obviously COVID-19 and the pandemic to be a large social issue that still will impact us for likely years to come. And I wanted to focus on teachers specifically because I am an instructor and I think that education has been impacted a lot by the pandemic. So let's say I found some sources that talked about how teachers have been really burdened by the emotional aspects of the pandemic and the want to protect our students and protect ourselves, much like I think a lot of first responders and frontline workers have probably experienced. So my working thesis, after looking at my sources and kind of evaluating, okay, teachers have maybe been working more, working less, working more online, I found that the emotional burden and the stress have had the biggest impact from the pandemic. Of all of these changes, I've decided that the emotional burden has been the most, not just for themselves, but for their students. And this is probably actually supported by what I've experienced, so I think that's also what makes it a good thesis. Then I go on to say, this is leading to a record number of teachers leaving the profession and the future of American education in flux. I think this is actually something really interesting, the phenomenon of what they're calling the Great Resignation, all of these people in the last couple years quitting their jobs and advocating for what they need in their professional lives. And I think for education in particular, this is leaving a lot of questions. A lot of us are like, who is going to teach the children? Who is going to teach all of us? And what changes does our education system need to make to help teachers deal with this emotional burden and this added stress that's not going to go away? But a couple things I want you to notice. This is related to my research question. It is debatable. Someone else could say, you know, actually, I don't think the emotional burden was the worst part of the pandemic. I think teachers are fine. And it's a statement. It also kind of sets up the rest of my paper. So you're not drafting your paper yet this week, but you will next week. So I want you to have a working thesis that you can go somewhere with, all right? So it's a statement that answers that question. They are related, but they are not the same, all right? So that's the first thing you want to kind of think about this week. And that actually is going to be discussed in one of your readings as well. So the next thing I want to go over is your categorizing and evaluating sources. So the assignment sheet's on Blackboard under our week 13 folder. It is based on Krauss chapter 9, which is one of the readings for this week. So of course, start there. But the goals of the categorization is to help you make better sense of the evidence you have. It's going to enable you to compare and contrast different pieces of evidence, and then kind of evaluate these, and then also give you a clearer sense of the evidence you have, and most importantly, the evidence you are lacking. So this is something we're going to talk about in your discussion board this week. I want you to post your working thesis and then several what I'm calling antithesis arguments, like a counter argument to what you believe. And if none of your sources are considering that counter argument, you need to do some more looking. All right, so that's kind of what this assignment's going to help you do. There is a sample on Blackboard. Let me pull that up. So this is a student example of the categorizing assignment. This student looked at mental disabilities, and I remember this student, it's from my fall 2020 class, wow, long time. Anyway, I remember this student in particular had a son that had a mental disability, and they were really interested in how our government and social systems kind of play into the lives of people with mental disabilities. So they've got their cover page. What you'll notice on the second page is literally a chart where they've kind of categorized all their sources. So their sources are here on the left-hand side. Each source is individual, and you'll notice that they have 6 total, which is the number you need. Across the top, this student decided to break this down by type of source, but then they also added a column published after the ADA. The ADA is the American with Disabilities Act, and that in particular applied to their topic. So what they did was kind of categorized by type of source, and then also looked at, was it published after that American with Disabilities Act? So this is really just a way to kind of visually represent your sources and help you to see what you're missing. So here, I noticed they have a very good mix of web-based, academic, and government sources. All of them have been published after the ADA. So they might think, okay, maybe I should have one published before the ADA so I could see how things have changed. But in essence, you want a chart that looks like this. What you put at the top is going to be based on you. It's going to be based on your thesis, it's going to be based on your topic. But then underneath the chart, you'll notice they have written about how they've compared their sources. They said, I noticed many of my sources were very similar. I chose to start categorizing them by type of source, and then I wanted to see if any sources I chose were published before the passing of the ADA. Later, I believe, here. One thing I noticed, which was a weakness for me, is that all the evidence I found is supporting my working thesis. Their thesis is, some people believe the only challenge with intellectual disabilities is the one with fellow citizens who may mistreat those with a learning disability, but it's also the law. So their thesis actually is that the problem for people with mental disabilities is that the law does not support them. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. So that's a great thesis, but what they found out is that all of their sources support their thesis. So now they want to think about, okay, how can I give a counter argument to what I'm arguing? And that's important because it really does strengthen your persuasiveness, because you're saying, hey, I've also looked at other perspectives. So this student example should help you a lot. The assignment sheet is also on Blackboard. It's going to be 3 to 4 pages. You're going to need 6 sources total. These can include your annotated bibliography, and then I need you to add more, so 6 total. And then give your working thesis. How have you started to answer your question? And then the rest of it will describe the categories, any strengths and weaknesses, and then any kind of connections that you're making. So a lot of my students really overthink this assignment. Take it piece by piece. Decide your working thesis, make your chart, and then just talk to me about the chart. Tell me what it's showing you. All right? You're really just analyzing, making connections, sort of visually showing me where your thoughts are. All right? So, and honestly, I find this to be the most helpful assignment for this second writing project. All right, let me skip back through. Okay. So, also consider your group for help. If you're not sure how to categorize your sources, then ask. You can categorize by author, by type, by content. See if your working thesis can give you some categories. So if I went back to my thesis about the emotional burden on teachers for the pandemic, maybe I would categorize by type of burden. So I could have physical, I could have emotional, I could have family, I could talk about like classroom management, and then I could see which of my sources talk about which burden. So there's definitely not one way to do it. Make sure you add 3 more sources to your list. And Krauss in chapter 9 has an example of a source. Of a chart that can also kind of help you. So from here, a couple things that I noticed. They also used the type of source at the top, but then they also had some topics here. So what I noticed was that their web sources, their more like popular sources said that hacking is bad, but their academic source mentioned that hacking can be good. So they were looking at hacking as a topic. Then these were some questions that kind of got me thinking from this chart. Notice that their web-based sources kind of mentioned how hacking is always bad, but their government source, they've only got one. So maybe they might look for more of that. So these are the kind of things you might notice once you put your chart together. You're pretty much just saying, okay, how do my categories line up? All right, so there's an example in Krauss that you can look at, and then make sure that you do your group check-in for this week. The 2 questions I want you to answer, looking over the research essay assignment sheet, do you have any questions or concerns? And then in your group, who will be responsible for which sections of the paper? This is going to be important for when we start next week. Alrighty, y'all. So that is how I'd like you to work this week, and good luck. I will talk to you soon.